I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're going to talk about a few Three Musketeers adaptations, and I did say, when introducing my pick last time, that we would be chiefly talking about Albert the Fifth Musketeer, which is a cartoon that we used to watch as children.
I believe the production year on it is 1993. Certainly it was on CBBC around then and a couple of years afterwards.
And I don't specifically remember exactly how it went, but at some stage I was flicking through the channels or something. There was probably nothing on CITV, which we normally watched, and I found a cartoon going on that had Athos, Porthos, Aramis, D'Artagnan, and the rest of the gang, or many of them anyway. And I immediately recognised the characters, of course, from D'Artagnan, which we talked about a long time ago, and was a big part of our childhoods. And I very much suspect, and I think we've discussed before, that probably this show was commissioned or even conceived because it was very likely that the target audience would know D'Artagnan, and perhaps off the back of that know about Dumas, the Three Musketeers, and maybe have seen some other films and things.
Which was certainly true of us.
If you know anything about the Musketeers, you very quickly get from the title Albert the Fifth Musketeer that it's a sort of twist on the original story, where there is a protagonist who is an unsung hero, someone that we don't know about from Dumas' stories and any other adaptations we may have seen. And it reminds me more than a little of Blazing Dragons, which we also talked about a long time ago, where Flicker, the protagonist, is an unsung hero, and Albert does some very similar things to Flicker, specifically inventing things, and with or without his inventions being the hero of the whole thing and saving the day, while the original heroes, the people that we have been led to believe are the heroes in other media, are a bit crap and a bit incompetent. But I also noticed some differences, the main one being that Albert's contemporaries do appreciate him and they work with him as a team very well, and even though they are a bit crap, they can do what they're supposed to do competently enough, so long as they've got Albert supporting them. And Albert really doesn't want any recognition from the king, but the Queen and Monsieur de Treville, the captain of the Musketeers, as I'm sure you do know what he does for them and do appreciate him, so that's nice.
It's a title that credits the audience with some intelligence/knowing stuff from the world, which people don't tend to nowadays as much as when we were little. Albert the Fifth Musketeer, it's taken as read that the audience will, and indeed did, know who the original four Musketeers are. Nowadays, the audience will be like, oh, who's the other four then? Before watching the show.
Yes, you've just reminded me of when you were saying basically the same thing about Maid Marian and Her Merry Men as a title.
That's true as well. I'm reminded of something I said in the D'Artagnan podcast about how the closing narration, the end of the Return of D'Artagnan, says they'll live forever in our hearts as D'Artagnan and the Three Muskehounds, and I said, yes, I do always think there's something vaguely wrong when I watch Musketeers and they're not dogs. And it did seem very strange originally watching Albert and they weren't dogs, and even when I watch live-action films, there's always a small part of me that thinks, oh, they're not dogs. But Albert certainly is another very good Musketeers cartoon adaptation in a different way from D'Artagnan, perhaps. They certainly both have their place on children's telly and making up our Musketeers experiences when we were young.
I sort of got used to them not being dogs most of the time now, and when we go through all the adaptations we've seen, even if we don't say very much about them, we don't remember them very well, I think you'll see why. At first, yes, it was very odd watching Albert, and they were all people, and it does have a very different tone from D'Artagnan. It's not the same sort of adaptation. D'Artagnan starts as a very, very true and rather serious adaptation of the book, except that the difference is that they're nearly all dogs. I say starts off that way way, because it then goes off and starts making up its own plots and things. And the different thing about Albert is that it's kind of a piss take, an affectionate piss take, where you just kind of laugh about how silly and fun it is.
It is a lot of silly fun, and the characters are wonderful, eccentric caricatures. I'm thinking now particularly of the Duke of Buckingham. When we read The Three Musketeers, the book, a few years ago, it was particularly striking to notice that the Duke of Buckingham in the book is far more like Albert's Duke of Buckingham than D'Artagnan's Duke of Buckingham. And I'd have guessed it the other way round, but of course no, the book is comedy. Dumas is very effective with his comedy, and the comedic obsessed with the Queen of France, Duke of Buckingham from the book actually translates very well to Albert when he's leaping up 50 feet in the air going, "The Queen of France!" It's only one step further from what he actually does in the book.
Might as well carry on talking about him now, as Albert says at one stage the Duke's got into this situation where Marie de Medici, the Queen Mother, is making him work as her secretary, and he's having a terrible time, and there's all sorts of plots and things going on to discredit the Queen, and Buckingham's summary of the whole thing is, "I can't find the Queen's chamber," and Albert breaks the fourth wall to tell us he's totally obsessed. And that about sums him up. Whatever else is going on, he will be looking for and take any opportunity to see the Queen, even though I think he knows she's not going to do anything with him. He just wants to see her constantly. And it's all very over the top, as well as leaping in the air. He has sort of hearts exploding out of his eyes and all that cartoony kind of thing, the kind of thing that they teach you at Acme University and Tiny Toon Adventures, to be a cartoon character. So he's very much an extreme caricature, although you say it's only one step away, so perhaps not so extreme. And he features in not every episode, but quite a lot of episodes, or certainly quite a lot of the few we've got on our tapes.
They think of a few different ways to use him, get him in quite organically, including the one with the Duke of Buckingham double.
Yes, there's always a doppelganger episode in these things, isn't there? And in this case, it's a Duke of Buckingham doppelganger, and that's got one of my favourite bits. Richelieu and Milady find him by getting on Albert's human catapult and being catapulted into sort of Spain, I think, and falling through his roof, and his whole house has collapsed, and they're there in the middle of his kitchen, and this doppelganger's comment on the whole thing is, "There's the wood in my soup," which makes me absolutely kill myself laughing, and it just about sort of sums up the tone of the whole show, really.
It's wood that used to be part of his rafters because his house has collapsed, but that doesn't particularly seem to be bothering him at the moment. The Marie de Medici episode is the first one we have on our videotape recorded off CBBC, and it's an awfully good one. And it has a bit that I've always remembered and chuckled about, which sums up Albert and the Musketeers quite nicely, where he's telling them to look for the Duke of Buckingham discreetly, gentlemen. And of course their idea of looking for him discreetly is wandering around the palace and yelling at the top of their voices, "Yoo-hoo, are you there, Duke of Buckingham?" And we absolutely love that.
Yes, it's quite a good first episode to have, really.
It is, it shows you exactly the tone, exactly the characters and relationships. Better first episode than the 6 first production episodes that we've got on those official VHS releases where it's still finding its feet, actually.
That is so true. And going on to talk more about the Four Musketeers, that episode also shows how they pretty much do know what's going on and can cope when it comes to it, because when they find the Duke of Buckingham, D'Artagnan also spots Marie de Medici coming down the corridor and says the Queen Mother mustn't see him, and they succeed in hiding him.
I think he's rather well done, D'Artagnan. They present him as a sort of upper-class twit. Sometimes he manages to do things rather well, but usually relies on Albert. And of course, D'Artagnan from the book isn't an upper-class twit at all, or indeed from D'Artagnan. He's a farm boy. But for Albert, it works really, really well. D'Artagnan a bit clueless, the de facto leader, and presenting to the world the front of, yes, the Musketeers are doing everything in a very competent, can rely on us. Of course, we know behind the scenes what's really going on.
What they do bring over from the book is D'Artagnan's quick temper and constantly picking fights with the Cardinal's guards, which also reminds one of D'Artagnan, particularly the Return of D'Artagnan, where there's a massive sword fight in every episode. And the Cardinal's guards are going around with their red clothes on, so if you find that and you're familiar with D'Artagnan, you get exactly what's going on.
There's kind of a Cardinal's guard who's the sort of physical equivalent of all 5 Musketeers you can spot in the show. They're in it at times, sometimes all of them together, sometimes in little groups, which I thought was quite a nice touch. You really notice it when it's the Albert equivalent Cardinal Guard, who is, of course, very, very short. That's one of Albert's characteristics.
Yes, you particularly notice it then, and you might well have noticed there's a large one like the large Porthos. Let's talk about the other Musketeers, who are more sort of supporting characters, really, aren't they? It's kind of like in the first series of D'Artagnan, to be honest. We must have talked about how they're not used very much, and at least the 3 Musketeers do join in with whatever's going on, but it's generally in a sort of supporting role. Now, Athos, as we also discussed talking about D'Artagnan, is quite difficult to adapt from the book for a cartoon, for a thing aimed primarily at children, because what's his character in the book? He drinks and has this secret past where he's been married to Milady, who was a thief and adulteress and all kinds of things. And what's Athos like in Albert? He's the stupidest, most incompetent one. He will always be, for example, facing the wrong way. And at one stage he has the front of his tunic all up over his face when he's supposed to be paying attention to what's going on. And he has grey hair, which signifies that he's older than them. And another thing that you might take from the book is that he's a sort of father figure to D'Artagnan in particular, and the most senior of the Musketeers, so that comes across in his design. And then there's Porthos, and of course it was watching Albert, I think, that made me realise they got them the wrong way round in one of the two, D'Artagnan or Albert, and I had to watch another adaptation before I knew which one was correct, and of course Albert is correct. And there are a number of caricaturish characteristics that Dumas' Porthos has. He wants to be a member of the nobility, and he drinks a lot. He is spoiling for a rumble a lot of the time. He likes women, possibly prostitutes. He likes food, and that's really the one they've gone with in Albert. All he really wants to do is eat the whole time, and one of our favourite one-liners is when D'Artagnan's saying while they're in the inn, "Landlord, 4 more chickens, please," and Porthos goes, "Yes, I'll have 4 more too."
Absolutely brilliant. I was absolutely knocked for 6 when Albert hands Porthos this iron bar and says, "Porthos, can you bend this?" And he goes, "Of course." And I think, oh, Athos, Porthos, which is which? And that was the first time it hit me. And that's something else that Porthos does, of course, very much like Athos in particularly early D'Artagnan, have his great strength and use it to achieve whatever they're trying to achieve in that episode.
And then there's Aramis. And I think it's the only time, certainly the only one I can think of, where Aramis is blonde. And I always remember Dumas describes him as being fair-haired, so that's quite pleasing. And he's the same sort of shape as the Duke of Buckingham. And I will just mention this, in everything, or very nearly everything we've seen, whether deliberately or by complete coincidence, the Duke of Buckingham does always look slightly like Aramis. And there's the very quick thing of a case of mistaken identity, which is in the book and which is in D'Artagnan, but no one else ever really bothers with it, but they still have them look slightly similar, not like identical twins or anything, but the same kind of build and shape that you could mistake in the dark.
And hair shape.
That's right, which is the main similarity between Aramis and Buckingham in Albert. And I think Aramis perhaps suffers from the series developing and other characters developing, and they sort of forget to really do anything with him. In the earlier episodes, he talks in rhyme a lot, and I think you were telling me you found that quite annoying.
I don't like it when they try to have him talk in rhyming couplets. It never sounds very good, and it's completely unnecessary. story, they try to have him be a bit romantic, and he has a hanky and flowers and things at times, which is fine, but they don't need to extend it to try to have him talking in, like, poetry is what they're going for, I think.
So I guess that's why they stopped really bothering. Maybe they think it's stupid too, or not worth sustaining. So in the ones that are on our recorded video, rather than the ones on the officially released videos that I bought secondhand from Amazon or somewhere, he doesn't say very much, and what he does say is either sort of lines anyone could say, like, that stupid Athos fell in the hole, or he might sort of make a gentling, pacifying comment with his hanky or whatever.
Saying Athos is a trap that Cam Clarke as D'Artagnan fell into only once, but that Leonardo DiCaprio does all the time in a film we'll mention.
So that's all 4 of the 3 Musketeers, which is a sort of running gag in the show, which I find a bit unnecessary. The book's called The 3 Musketeers because D'Artagnan doesn't become a musketeer till the end. It's fine, but they go with that anyway. And perhaps we'd better talk a bit more now about Albert the Fifth Musketeer. We've already mentioned most things, haven't we, that he invents, and he's the protagonist and sorts things out, and he's small, and sometimes, occasionally, that has got to do with the plot, or even if it hasn't, Milady refers to him as the Little Musketeer. I suppose what it does, it makes him very distinctive, it makes him easy to spot if the Musketeers are all together. It's perhaps symbolic of how it's always the quiet ones behind the scenes sorting things out. Aramis at one point says something about him being small in stature but not in courage, which is a nice bit of sort of poetry, he says. It's not rhyming, but it's actually saying something and making a valid point.
And it also means Albert can disguise himself as a small boy with a lolly whenever he needs.
Not that this happened very often. And if I hadn't watched it for a long time, and you were asking me what I remembered, I might say I remembered Albert interacting with Treville quite a lot. He's always showing Treville his inventions, and Treville gets into some trouble with them. For example, just before Milady and Cardinal Richelieu, hiding in barrels, get catapulted over the Pyrenees or wherever they end up, Treville has gone on it and slammed right into the wall, because the setting is too short range, and then he over-adjusts it so it becomes too long range and that kind of thing. And he's got this umbrella that's going to rain on the Queen's flowers, and it absolutely soaks him in water. So they do quite a lot of sort of slapstick stuff. Treville. And he's trying out these springs that you can fix to your boots or shoes or whatever you've got on, and boying along, leaping in the air, and he's going to see the king, and he kind of crashes through the roof. And that may be the time when the king says, de Treville, there you are, in a sort of tone of voice like, that's not the usual way to come in, is it? But another time, the Queen does a similar sort of joke, where the king, feeling insecure about his small size, i.e. in between most other characters and Albert, is on this sort of, carjack thing, and raising himself higher and higher and higher, and he ends up with his head bursting through her floor, and she turns around and says, "Oh, Louis, there you are," like it's just completely normal. And that's much funnier. So I think her interpretation of the situation like that was much more Albert humour, Albert tone. Going back to Treville, another thing we like is where he's falling out of the window with his pyjamas on because he's heard Albert inventing fireworks, I think, and crashes through the ground and makes this Treville-shaped hole in the ground. And he's got his pyjamas on, he's got his candle, and then he remembers he has to go and meet the Queen, so he pops down into the hole, same second, pops up again with all his regular clothes on.
And modern audiences would say, oh, how did his clothes get in the hole that he's just made? But of course it doesn't matter, it's Albert humour, and we absolutely loved it, and we were right to do so.
And that's mainly the sort of thing they do with Treville in terms of actual characterisation. I'm thinking of a bit in the one where they're doing this sports competition between the Cardinal's Guards and the Musketeers, Musketeers. He's helping out, distracting the king and the queen from things while Albert's doing the grunt work, sorting things out. He's constantly bickering with the cardinal, sometimes leaping to the defence of his Musketeers like a good leader, sometimes just being a bit sort of competitive about his men versus the cardinal's men for the sake of it. And shall we talk about the cardinal now? He does very much the same sort of thing as the cardinal in the book and in D'Artagnan, except usually the stakes aren't so high. He's plotting to further his own interests, but not to actually make anybody die or anything like that. Like, he wants to be the one to present the king with strawberries. In fact, he deliberately has all the strawberries from Paris removed and made into jam so that he will have the only strawberries and give them to the king. And it's mostly that kind of thing. Of course, a lot of the time he's trying to make it look like the Queen is dallying with the Duke of Buckingham, but he never really talks about what he hopes will come of that. Presumably, the penalty, if she were found guilty, would be death. And in terms of characterisation, I don't know, it's hard to describe. He's always very sort of deadpan. He doesn't have very many funny lines. He's got these bunny slippers that he's sometimes at pains to conceal from the king, and he sort of gets into similar awkward situations like that.
I like the bit where he's trying to conceal the fact he's got all the stolen strawberries in his office, and he pulls this pull cord, and a screen with a picture of the rest of his office comes down and covers them. Very funny.
They're always quite quick throwaway comedy moments with the cardinal, aren't they? Mainly what he does is, in his evil voice, with his evil chuckle, tell Milady what to do. So let's talk about her now, and we haven't mentioned voice actors yet.
It's one of the things, many things that were around at the time, with Jimmy Hibbert and Sue Sheridan. And some other people.
Yeah, some other people who aren't memorable at all, I'm afraid, but all of them very good, except Sue Sheridan. I don't think she's up to the standard of the others, and we've said before, we don't like to talk unpleasantly about dead people, because they're the ones who are going to listen, if any of the actual stars of these things listen. But I've always thought Sue Sheridan's voice talents are fine for the Family Nurse and Secret 7 audiobooks and things like that, but Albert is really quite high-level comedy, and you have to really get it, and you have to really time it perfectly and say it in just the right tone of voice, and she's really not there with that as Milady.
I was listening to the original radio Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series quite recently. I thought she was terrible in that, for the same reason.
I mean, she's one of the things that makes The Black Cauldron the last Disney movie before they realised they needed to sort it out with The Little Mermaid, not what it ought to be. But I don't think we really need to say anything else about that now. We can just talk about Milady as a character, her role in the show. Again, it's very sort of slapstick. Whilst trying to do what she's doing, she gets into some situations, like she's hiding under a carpet and the Queen and her maid throw all this stuff on her. Of course, there's that one episode where she's dressed as some kind of animal, I think a mouse, the whole time for absolutely no reason, which is very weird, and weirder than Albert ought to be.
It took a while, I think, to notice, it's not relevant to the plot, it's not mentioned. Somebody's done it at some sort of animation/storyboard stage for some reason, but not a good reason.
Yes, perhaps it's from some sort of cut scene. She was disguising herself for some reason, cut long ago. But she does all the usual sort of things she does whilst dressed as a mouse. It's the one where they're trying to stop Mr. Blackcross and his water ballet performing tortoises from coming to the Queen's party. So she's going around dressed as a mouse, putting all these tortoises in her box and stuff. I'm trying to think if she ever interacts with anybody other than the Cardinal and Albert. Certainly the King, Treville, and the Queen never see her. I'm not sure about the Four Musketeers. But she's often hiding around the palace, and when the Cardinal pulls down his backdrop to conceal all the strawberries, she's there eating them. And there are a lot of secret passages and cubbyholes and things, and she always enters the Cardinal's office by some unconventional means, like he pulls a sort of cord and she drops through the ceiling, and a funnier actress, I said I wasn't going to talk about this anymore, but the sound she makes could have been much funnier. Except this one time where the Cardinal's calling her and he realises he's sitting over a sort of trap door thing and he gets out of the way of it because he normally gets hit by whatever she's coming through. And she comes through the door and hits him on the head with it, so that's quite funny. And of course, secret passages are occasionally featured in Dumas' book, and there's a bit of a secret passage in D'Artagnan, and they really make a big comedy running gag out of it for Albert, which is very much the sort of thing that they do in the way that they adapt the ideas from the book.
Jimmy Hibbert plays principally Albert, the King, and Athos. I remember talking on our Duckula podcast about how Jimmy Hibbert's voice acting skills were his strength. Of course, he delivered that line you mentioned from the King in a way that overdid it and made sure it wasn't as funny as it could have been. But an uncharacteristic slip up there, I think, rather than something to judge him by as a rule of thumb.
Yes, of course, his interpretation of Louis is normally very on point. There's that bit that's really quite satirical where all he wants is strawberries and he's got all this food in front of him that they've brought him, blancmange and pineapples and all kinds of things, and they're saying there are no strawberries. He says, well then, I shall just have to starve. And of course, as everyone knows, the king had much too much in those days and the salt of the earth had practically nothing, which led to a revolution a couple of hundred years later. He's very sort of childlike, frivolous, if anything, quite serious, as far as Albert can be serious between Treville and the Cardinal. He'll sort of laugh and make a joke out of it and get entertainment out of it. And what they're really trying to do most of the time is run around knocking themselves out to satisfy his whims, and the strawberries really is a very good example of that. And from the king, let's talk about the queen. And I suppose this is quite like D'Artagnan too, the first series anyway. The king doesn't really have much to do with the protagonist, in this case, Albert. In fact, he has nothing to do with him. The king has very little to do with D'Artagnan. And in both cases, they have more to do with the queen, and she's much more aware of them and getting them to help her. But of course, the king doesn't need help, does he? He's the one that, in many cases, people need protection from, particularly the queen, where the cardinal's trying to make him think that she's at it with Buckingham and all that kind of thing. And Albert hangs out with the queen really quite a lot, and I was saying earlier she knows he exists, she knows what he does for her, she's always very grateful to him, and she wants to present him with medals when the other musketeers are getting them, and always asks Treville, well, where is he? And, he doesn't want a medal. And as a character, in some ways she's a bit sort of spoilt, naive, a little stupid, but she's also very kind, very fair, helps wherever she can to sort things out, bring about the right result. At one stage she flies Albert's flying machine. To save the king, the queen shall peddle, she says, and mucks in and gets her hands dirty. So I always thought she was rather a good representation of Anne of Austria. And again, I suppose a lot of that really is carried over from Dumas himself. So that probably really is everything that there is to say about Albert. From realising that D'Artagnan was more than just D'Artagnan, and in fact it was based on human characters, we've seen, as well as reading the book when we're a bit older, quite a lot of adaptations. And I think next we're going to talk about what people say is the definitive one. And I've seen reviews of it saying, it's absolutely brilliant, it's everything you need from a Musketeers adaptation. I don't know why anybody ever bothers watching any other ones. And that is the two-part film, which was originally supposed to be a one-part film from the 1970s, starring Michael York as D'Artagnan and some other actors they were very pleased to have. Raquel Welch as Constance. Speaking of whom, I very briefly mentioned the Queen's maid, didn't I? And I like to call her Constance, the one in Albert, even though she's never given a name, and I have sometimes speculated that she may have been given the name Constance if it hadn't been for Juliet and the target audience being so used to Juliet in the Constance role. But everywhere else, that character is called Constance, and we will refer to her as Constance, and I now think of her as Constance and Juliet as the dog version of Constance. And who else is in this film? Oliver Reed as Athos, Richard Chamberlain, I think Hollywood was quite keen on him at the time, weren't they, as Aramis? Oh, Charlton Heston, of course, as Richelieu. Faye Dunaway as Milady, Frank Finlay as Porthos, and I said that in a sort of bored tone of voice because I think he wasn't such a box office draw as the others, but he's quite as good in the film as anybody else. And Roy Kinnear as Planchet, and Christopher Lee as Rochefort.
There were some interesting familiar faces to spot in it, including Spike Milligan as Bonacieux. And in the very first portion of the Three Musketeers movie, I recognised Joss Ackland as D'Artagnan's dad. And apparently, I later found out looking up the film, D'Artagnan's mum was played by Gretchen Franklin in that scene, aka Ethel from EastEnders, who gets around. There's a lot of interesting actors in it. I was particularly struck when we were watching it quite recently, watching the DVD you got of those two movies for the second time, how it was very like D'Artagnan, the early part of the movie particularly staged like D'Artagnan at his home farm with his parents and then coming to the inn and fighting with Rochefort. It was like D'Artagnan but in fast forward mode, and we speculated perhaps D'Artagnan did take some inspiration from those movies, and indeed was right to do so, as long as it wasn't comedy inspiration. Staging inspiration worked very well.
Yes, of course, those scenes do come directly out of the book, but we've discovered, or I have, and I think you agreed with me, that how much you enjoy these two films, The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, is very dependent on your expectations. I got this double-pack DVD having seen all of the first movie, I think, and maybe bits of the second movie a long time ago, and thinking there was nothing wrong with them, certainly, and having read these reviews of how brilliant it is, watched it and thought, oh my god, this is terrible. This is a really bad film. This is a really bad interpretation of The Three Musketeers. And then when we watched it more recently, we kind of liked it, because we had these low expectations. If it wasn't for the silly slapstick comedy, there would really be nothing wrong with it. And as an adaptation of the book, if you ignore that stuff, it's pretty good.
Like you said, they're trying to do it as comedy because the Dumas book is comedy swashbuckling, but they're not doing it with Dumas' comedy. They're doing it with Richard Lester, the director's comedy, which in many people's opinion is so detrimental to the Superman movies that we'll talk about in times to come. But that's not really paying homage to the original, is it? Doing different comedy to try and evoke the Dumas comedy.
That's true. It is stupid comedy, in my opinion. Very physical. People are coming to take Constance, to implicate the Queen in the whole Duke of Buckingham fandango, and Bonacieux can't load his gun and that kind of thing. And Constance as a character is clumsy. So whatever she's trying to do, she's knocking over vases, she's sewing the Queen's sleeve under the rest of her dress. And it's just stupid and unfunny, in my opinion.
I came into the DVD watch through we had recently thinking, oh god, these are terrible, I'm not going to enjoy it, and then was pleasantly surprised. I certainly didn't hate them like I thought I was going to, as you were saying, and I thought, yes, the ingredients are right, really. The costumes, the staging, the setting, the intention of the whole thing, but it's just gone rather wayward with the comedy.
It is very true to the book, isn't it? Obviously, you could find some bits, probably quite a lot of bits, that are different, because adaptations are never exactly the same, but it is basically very true to the book, and I think that's the reason people like it. If they've loved the book, and they want to see a true adaptation, they got one.
And if there are die-hard fans of Richard Lester's slapstick comedy movies out there, they certainly never write anything on the internet about Superman 3, so perhaps, really, popularity of the Three and Four Musketeers, it is fair to say, is in spite of the comedy adaptation, rather than because of it.
I think so. There was one bit that made me laugh the first time. It was a subversion of when, in these kinds of things, the hero leaps through a window, finds the enemy, and pulls the carpet out from under them. D'Artagnan does this, except he doesn't because the carpet rips, and these Cardinal's guards are quite surprised, and they say, he's torn our carpet, which made me laugh the first time, but when you're expecting it, it's not really funny anymore. But it's a different kind of comedy, that, isn't it? It's not slapstick, it's sort of subversion, funny comment comedy.
I was reading quite recently a list of some of his trademark comedy that Richard Lester snuck into Superman 2 in the end. And I was thinking, oh yes, those are the stupid bits, and it is like the Musketeers in Superman 3. And yes, they're my least favourite bits of Superman 2, so perhaps we should all breathe a collective sigh of relief that Richard Lester vowed never to direct another movie after 1989's The Return of the Musketeers. which I remember watching on telly with our supper when we were quite young.
I have no memory of that.
And all the cast, including Christopher Lee, who really should have been dead, whose character really was killed at the end of The Four Musketeers and shouldn't have come back. And then, of course, he dies again in The Return of the Musketeers. Came back. Even King Louis XIII, actually, I can't remember his name, has a cameo as a different character, Cyrano de Bergerac. And Charlton Heston wanted to be in it, and they said, no, you're dead. So he posed for this portrait that is in it. And it was fun coming back and doing it all again 14 years later. But of course, the unfortunate thing about it was that Roy Kinnear very sadly accidentally died after falling off a horse. And apparently, Richard Lester blamed himself in many ways for not making the instructions clear to the stagehands who washed down these cobbles that the horse was going to walk on and made the horse slip or something. I mean, you can blame yourself for anything, can't you, if you think about it long enough? Which is a very sad sequence of events and an awful thing to happen when you get back together after 15 years and have a bit of fun making a third movie. And we did have a look at some of it on YouTube in Portuguese. We didn't really listen to it, we just had a look at the odd bits or what was going on.
Well, I'll just say this now. I did think if I could find a DVD of it for under £2 second hand, it would be worth watching for this podcast. And you can't get it for less than about £25, which is weird. And on YouTube, they only had it in Portuguese, didn't they? And a couple of trailers, which we looked at.
But it's interesting that it is adapted from 20 years after. Got the beheading of Charles I, bit of a spoiler there. And it's got Kim Cattrall as Milady's daughter, of course in the book it's her son, but filling very much the same role in the story. And I was speculating that perhaps if it wasn't for the tragedy of Roy Kinnear, perhaps everyone would have got back together in the late 90s to do the Vicomte de Bragelonne, or at least the Man in the Iron Mask part that everybody knows, and kind of finish off the whole story. But as Richard Lester, Michael York and friends obviously weren't entertaining this as a possibility after such a terrible occurrence when they last all got together, I began to wonder if the Man in the Iron Mask film made in 1997 with a different cast was actually kind of an attempt by someone to fill that gap, to carry on the legacy of the Musketeers movies in some way. Certainly it was never billed as such or advertised as such, but it was an interesting idea, I thought, because I've sometimes wondered, well, why just make that? You come into The Man in the Iron Mask 97 and you think, or at least I did, if you came into this blind, you'd expect there to be a film from 10, 20 years ago with younger Jeremy Irons, Gerard Depardieu and everyone in it doing all these things they're talking about. But there isn't. But now I think, well, maybe it kind of fills that gap. It would be about the right time for it to be made. And it's not trying to be the same continuity or anything, but perhaps it is just a kind of attempt at a spiritual sequel.
Well, however much it was bearing those films in mind, like Albert, it does expect the audience to know the characters and know that they have a story before this one that they're presenting to us now. And I like that film, and I've got that film on DVD, along with William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and Titanic, also starring Leonardo DiCaprio. And you were quite amused when I was describing the trailer and analysing why it was an effective trailer, and I said, well, it starts off with, here's Leonardo DiCaprio for you, and from there you get into it's about the Musketeers, who you may also know, or if you're not interested in Leonardo DiCaprio, here's something you may be interested in. Very effective, and it certainly got me to the cinema because I did like Leonardo DiCaprio. And you've already criticised his pronunciation of Athos earlier, but I don't think either of us really objects to Leo, do we? I think he is a perfectly fine actor.
Yes, I've started to enjoy watching his performances from the late 90s/early noughties more in recent years than I ever did at the time. I think he's very funny in a lot of cases, a lot of scenes where he needs to be, and quite engaging. We've enjoyed him quite recently in The Beach, which I've been curious about watching for a few years and was on a couple of Christmases ago, and we've ended up with DVD.
Yes, that film relies on him to carry the whole thing, and he does.
He does a very good job of that. And Catch Me If You Can, which was amusing and interesting when we watched it. So yes, when I mentioned Leo's inability to say Athos, I didn't mean to imply that I don't enjoy him at all, because I do.
in the late 90s, people like Barry Norman and some other people I spoke to or wrote to or saw on the television, I can't even really remember now, were very rude about poor Leo. I think they took one look at his beautiful face, thought, oh, that's how he got the part, and then saw what they expected to see, which was a bad actor. But no, I think his performances are very good, particularly in the Basketball Diaries, which was really his breakout role, wasn't it? The one that got him discovered, because he acts so well in that. And speaking of pronunciations, accents, I have a lot of respect for the way that everyone just uses their own accent. In those Richard Lester films, a couple of people, the American actors, do what I call an ancient Greek accent, which I'll say because there's a very brief story behind it. It was Brad Pitt in Troy attempting what sounded like it was supposed to be an English accent, even though the film is not set in England. And Jake said, what accent is he doing? And I said, ancient Greek. But in The Man in the Iron Mask, Leonardo DiCaprio is American, John Malkovich as Athos is American, Gerard Depardieu as Porthos is French, Jeremy Irons as Aramis is English, and Gabriel Byrne as D'Artagnan is Irish, but goodness knows what his natural accent is. He's done so many in all his different films, I think his natural voice is kind of no particular accent. And everyone just used their own voice, their own accent, and they all gelled and had good chemistry and played off each other well, and it really doesn't matter that they don't talk in the same way. The film's set in France, they're speaking English because it's a Hollywood production. It doesn't matter what accent that's in, just like it doesn't matter in a film set in ancient Greece. So I like that, and I like the cast. Those are the main ones. There are some supporting characters as well. Queen Anne is still there. This character called Christine, who in the book is Louise de la Vallière, a real historical character and mistress of Louis XIV. And Athos' son Raoul, who we saw in that Portuguese Return of the Musketeers and that trailer. And of course his role in The Man in the Iron Mask portion of the Vicomte de Bragelonne story is to die and be Athos' motivation for trying to replace Louis XIV with Philippe. And an interesting thing is that in the book they don't succeed, but in that film and another film that I've seen, which had Richard Chamberlain as Philippe and Louis XIV, they do succeed. So Hollywood likes them to succeed because they want the Musketeers as protagonists trying to replace a bad king with a nice king and succeeding.
That reminds me of your funny story about Alicia's attic on Live and Kicking, because of course apparently they didn't understand any of that replacing a bad king with a good king stuff. On what level did they understand it?
I think I've just described it in the most basic terms, the minimum that you really should, but what Alicia's attic tell us is there's a couple of twins and one of them's rich and one of them's poor and they swap places. And that was their summary of the film, and it really was quite inadequate.
They thought they were watching The Prince and the Pauper, probably that one with Mark Lester.
And I do really think I've summed up my feelings of that film. I like it a lot. I think the performances are good. At first I wasn't sure if I liked John Malkovich. He's got quite an annoying voice. Not meaning to be rude, but there's a scene he does with Philippe, Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's actually a very moving scene. And the two actors convey everything they're supposed to convey, and I find myself engaged by this scene, and that for me is confirmation that, yeah, they're both good actors, they're both a good choice for the role. And the chemistry between the Musketeers, the four of them has to be good, and it is good. I think it's really well cast. Probably the script is only quite average, isn't it? And then it's this cast that really brings it to life, makes it what it is.
Which is usually the case with things. The right actors bringing the script to life is what makes something brilliant, rather than a brilliant script. Most of the time, I think it's fair to say.
And I think that leads us nicely into the BBC TV series from this century, because that is exactly what happened there. A very, very nearly perfect cast, and we will tell you about the exception, which may shock you. But first of all, a little bit of background. It came off the back of Robin Hood and Merlin, both of which I thought were pretty bad. I know a lot of people love Merlin in particular. I think perhaps fantasy being very popular at the time was part of that and why people talked about it more than Robin Hood. And sometimes I do think of the Musketeers in the same sort of vein as Robin Hood and Camelot, because even though those two are English folklore and the Musketeers is French historical fiction, it's kind of become legendary in its way, with all these many different adaptations, interpretations, going off on slightly different paths with it, like Albert I was comparing to Blazing Dragons. So I can see why the BBC did that, picked Musketeers as the next thing to adapt in that vein.
Yes, in a way, the Musketeers is very much folklore in the same way that Robin Hood and Camelot are. Obviously, we know that D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis are fictional characters being mixed in with some real historical characters. But the Musketeers was a real group of people in the past, just like there were probably real groups of outlaws in Sherwood Forest and probably real warring ancient Britons, one of whom was probably the original King Arthur.
Which is testament to the skill of Dumas, really. Everyone knows he started it, whereas with Legends, no one knows quite where it started, and it was word of mouth rather than print. So kudos to Dumas for creating his own legend.
Perhaps the fact that the character of Robin Hood was originally spread through ballads rather than being written down is why we don't think of him as a definite fictional character attached to something from real history, like we do with D'Artagnan and the Three Musketeers.
Now, I was saying that I hadn't enjoyed Robin Hood, I hadn't enjoyed Merlin. My expectations for the Musketeers, the source material of which I like more, my expectations were very low, because I think, as a rule, the more one likes the source material, the more disappointed one is, and therefore the more one hates any bad adaptation. But I liked the first two series of the Musketeers enough, more than enough, to get them on DVD, and we've watched them a few times. And in this case, I think the scripts were up to scratch, especially those written by the main creator, redactor, chief writer, Adrian Hodges.
You don't know what you've got till it's gone, do you? And the fact that he wasn't involved in writing the third series, and we hated it, really showed us that he was a vital part of what we liked about the show.
Yes, and now that that's been said, I think we better not mention the third series again, because all we do is slag it off. The first two series are the ones I have on DVD and the ones that I count in my headcanon. And with Adrian Hodges' ideas and the scripts into which he adapted them, came a really fantastic cast. There are loads of people in it playing various members of the gang. Ryan Cage as King Louis, Alexandre Dowling as Queen Anne, Mamie McCoy as Milady, Tamla Corey as Constance. All fantastic. And then the Musketeers, including Hugo Spear as Treville, possibly my favourite if I had to pick a number one, are absolutely brilliant. All gel really, really, really well together. As D'Artagnan, we have Luke Pasqualino, who, for the first series anyway, they picked up in a certain stage of physical development. He's still cute, but he's also sort of quite sexy, and very charismatic on the screen, and he plays a wonderful D'Artagnan. I absolutely love him. As Athos, we have Tom Burke, and they do really carry over from the book that whole tortured existence. And Adrian Hodges also redeems Milady to a great extent, and I found myself, particularly in the second series when they really pursue this, shipping Athos and Milady, and she's been misunderstood. Dumas, being a Victorian, is quite sort of sexist, and an evil woman is a really, really evil creature and irredeemable, and everything is her fault when she seduced this parson to do something evil with absolutely nothing he could do about it, had to go to bed with her, given no choice. And she'd done all these terrible things. Whereas Adrian Hodges has her being misunderstood, falling on hard times, having some bad luck. And he does the same sort of thing to that person called Marion in The Go-Between, which was adapted for TV in quite recent years. So I associate him with that phenomenon of taking an evil woman and giving her some redemption in adaptations. And I thought Tom Burke and Mamie McCoy actually had better chemistry than D'Artagnan and Constance, and I found myself very interested in their relationship and whether they were going to get back together, something that was never realised because of the bad third series. So Athos was able to have a lot more depth than in the children's adaptations, and in the extras on the DVD, the sort of documentaries, I find Tom Burke himself very amusing. He makes sort of funny jokes about putting a crash mat at the bottom of a ravine and things. Well, he probably could, but it wouldn't make much difference. Then, as Porthos, we have Howard Charles, and they've gone with the tall, strong aspect of his character from the book. He uses his strength a lot. He drinks for fun, which is something from the book. Porthos drinks for fun and Athos drinks to forget, is how I like to sum it up. But they've also given him a very different backstory from Dumas' Porthos, where he is the offspring of a rather unpleasant evil, as it turns out, member of the nobility and a black slave who raised him on her own in the Court of Miracles, and he's worked his way up from this poor background and this underprivileged background to become a musketeer, and sometimes faces a certain amount of racism, including somebody on the internet saying this has nothing to do with Dumas' Three Musketeers. Why do they get actors of colour just for the sake of it? But it seems to me when they do get actors of colour, to be, for example, Nancy in Oliver Twist, which happened quite a few years ago now, they don't do it for the sake of it. They do it to represent real people who would have been in these places and in these situations at the time. And Porthos's backstory, though it isn't the one Dumas made up for him, absolutely does reflect the existence of some people in 17th century France. And Howard Charles's performance is fantastic, and I think together with Dumas' influence, Adrian Hodges' adaptation and his performance, they've come up with a really fantastic interpretation of the character.
I always find it very interesting, all that Court of Miracles stuff, and it gave me an extra dimension of interest, context in The Hunchback of Notre Dame Disney when we watched it with our Disney watch-through.
And this reminds me of accents, which I was talking about before. I must put Aramis just to the back of my mind while I say this. They all have an English accent because they're all English actors, and they have an English accent that reflects their status in 17th century France. So the King and the Queen have quite posh accents. Not as posh as our Queen and co, actually, because that might be a bit much for the television. Athos, a member of the nobility, also has quite a posh accent. Porthos, from this background, has a bit more of a sort of not-so-posh accent, sort of street. And the one person who kind of spoils this whole thing is his old flame Flea, who lives in the Court of Miracles and has a very posh accent. But never mind. Constance has a slight sort of West Country twang, which possibly I'm getting a little bit offensive here, but suggests being in kind of trade because she is a cloth maker's wife. And D'Artagnan and Aramis, who I haven't spoken about yet, have just sort of normal in between, not posh, not unposh accents. And I think that works very well. They are not the accents they would have had, and it's not the language they would have spoken, but it just gives the English audience the idea of who they are and where they're from. And then there's Aramis, played by Santiago Cabrera, which is a little bit hard to pronounce. And he doesn't make many references to aspiring to become a priest, but it's what he's planning to do, or at least be a monk anyway, which is a kind of priest, but start from the bottom, at the end of the second series. And obviously he womanizes, and I say obviously because that's always what Aramis does in these adaptations, except Albert, where they don't really do that kind of thing. And that's what they've taken from Dumas. And he's also the doctor, isn't he? If anyone needs patching up, it's always Aramis who does it. So that's quite interesting. And if they need someone to speak Spanish, communicate with a Spanish antagonist or something, he speaks Spanish, which isn't taken from the book, but perhaps they thought of that and a bit of homage to Santiago's own background. And all of them really gel fantastically well and make for a very enjoyable adaptation. And I have not mentioned one actor from the first series, and that's the one that I don't like, that I think is a very noticeable noticeable blot on the whole thing. So we've lampooned Sue Sheridan and Richard Lester, and now we're going to do it to Peter Capaldi. I say that as though I'm anticipating some kind of reaction, because people seem to like Peter Capaldi. He's a respected actor. He was the Doctor very recently. I didn't think he was any good as the Doctor. Loads of people did. But it seems to me he's one of these people, and I feel the same way about Peter O'Toole and some other actors like that. They just do everything the same. So they get their lines, and they say their lines in the way that they say lines. And the Cardinal has some really fantastic lines that could have been really funny, really sharp, really evil, really clever sarcasm, thinking on his feet some of the time he has to do. And you can imagine someone like Clifford Norgate, we thought of, didn't we? Corders from Nightmare, saying them really, really, really well, and heaping a load of interesting dimensions onto this character. And Peter Capaldi couldn't do that, or at least not to my satisfaction.
I found it a real blot on the first series watching the DVDs. I think I find that more and more each time, and that's really why I think we both find the second series a lot more enjoyable, because of course Peter Capaldi is sodded off to play the Doctor, and they replace him with Mark Warren as Rochefort, as they call him, or Rochefort as I normally call him, who does a wonderful, funny, mad, insane, dangerous, obsessed with the Queen comedy, yet also incredibly threatening, evil, dangerous performance, and adds so much to the show, gels with the rest of the wonderful cast so well, and makes a wonderful viewing experience.
I think at one stage I said, if one actor had to leave after the first series, thank God it was Peter Capaldi, and in a way, thank goodness he was there to be it. But I suppose one didn't have to. If they got a better Cardinal, he wouldn't have gone to be Doctor Who, and he would have stayed. But yes, Mark Warren, as you said, really does gel with the rest of the cast. He gets it. He's a fantastic villain. There's this bit where he's getting this prostitute to pretend to be the Queen, which is very funny, and he's telling her to go and put some clothes on. He says, I brought you a dress and a crown. And the way he says it, it's funny, it's also quite disturbing. He's obviously dangerously mad. So, the first series is really good, but when Peter Capaldi's there, something's wrong. There's plenty of bits without him there, particularly bits involving the Musketeers and Treville. I love him. But then you never get him ruining an episode in series 2. If the main villain shows up, it's Mark Warren, and he's fantastic. And it's quite interesting, for the last couple of episodes, he has an eye patch on, because the Queen has stabbed him in the eye when he was trying to rape her, when he's finally snapped. And we were speculating that maybe they did that out of a bit of homage to Christopher Lee. I don't think we've mentioned this, but he, as Rochefort, had an eye patch on. Same eye, I think. And then that second series ends with Rochefort's death, with an open will they won't they with Athos and Milady, and you have to just leave it there if you realise the third series is a load of old balls, quite frankly.
And it leaves you wondering, is Aramis going to stay at this monastery or come and fight the war with the rest of the Musketeers?
That's right.
And of course, Santiago Cabrera apparently is one of these people who you hire for a regular role, and then he rather lets you down and scampers off quite quickly, and you can't pin him down. That seems to have been the case in Heroes, and also in the BBC's Merlin that Gracie was mentioning, where he played Lancelot sporadically. And I think probably somebody tempted him back into every episode of the crap third series of the Musketeers, because he is there in every episode of that third series, after the cliffhanger of will he be there or not, by saying, yes, it's definitely the end, it's all you have to commit to, Santi, please come and do it. So he did. So at least all four of them are there as they should be in that series.
Yes, I really wish they'd done it properly. Got the proper writers. Adrian Hodges has stuck around. I don't know if he jumped or he pushed. Replaced Mark Warren with another good actor, and finished what they started, but they didn't do that. But there you have two fantastic series anyway, or at least I do. Not everyone liked them. And to be fair, I can sort of see why. It is very different from the original if you love Michael York and Friends, because it's so true to the book and you think it's the definitive adaptation. Perhaps you wouldn't like Luke Pasqualino and Friends so much. So those are the ones we really know. And it's quite a lot, isn't it? And I would like to just briefly mention some other adaptations we've seen. long time ago, I caught the end of a film which depicted the sons of D'Artagnan, Porthos and Aramis, and the daughter of Athos wrapping up some adventure that they'd been doing. And I looked it up, and it's called At Sword's Point or The Sons of the Musketeers, and it was made in the sort of 1950s. And I just wanted to mention that because I want to mention all the adaptations that I know about. But I didn't watch it all the way through, but you had quite an amusing comment when I told you about it. Oh, it's one of those things where the characters just do exactly the same as their parents. But yes, that's exactly what it is, and D'Artagnan's son and Athos's daughter are the love interest, and that exists, and it's probably not much good. Stylistically, I remember it reminded me very much of things from around that time, like 1949 Little Women and Calamity Jane. And again, it shows how the Musketeers has become a sort of a legend, and different interpretations, and in this case sequels, are made. Like there was that thing on CITV that they made in Canada about Robin Hood's descendant, Robin with a Y hood, very much in the same vein as that.
Back to Sherwood.
That's it. And there's also a film which stars Chris O'Donnell as D'Artagnan and Martin Sheen as Aramis and Tim Curry as Richelieu, the actors I chiefly remember.
Also Kiefer Sutherland as Athos and Rebecca De Mornay as Milady. We actually bothered going to see that one in the cinema. I suppose it was a time when our mum had discovered that taking us to the cinema was a good way to entertain us when we were going to things like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. And we quite enjoyed it, I think. And I think we quite enjoyed it again when we watched it on the telly within the last 5 to 8 years.
Yes, it's a good, solid adaptation. And I seem to remember it's the adaptation of the Queen's Diamonds portion of the story. And we were saying, weren't we, the Three Musketeers, the first half of that Richard Lester production, is the Queen's Diamonds and finishes with the Return of the Queen's Diamonds and D'Artagnan getting his reward. That portion of the story is very adaptable. It seems like the end of a story, if not the story, and that's why D'Artagnan the movie has that as its conclusion. And that audio book that you don't remember, and the last time I saw it, it was in my care, so I must have lost it. That's recorded very much with children in mind and tells that portion of the story, The Queen's Diamonds. I can think of 2 films as well that were made this century. One of them was called The Musketeer, and I remember Mina Suvari was Constance, and the bit that's in all the trailers is D'Artagnan falling through the ceiling and finding her in the bar. And I watched that film, and I can't remember anything else about it apart from that couple of seconds, and I don't think I liked it very much.
All I remember about it is it had Arthur Fowler off of EastEnders in it, and I can't even remember in what part, so that shows you what I think of it.
And I can't remember him. I do think I can remember thinking, oh, it's not very true to the book. So, not very memorable, that one. And then after that, memorable for being a steaming pile of poo, is a film that's probably called The Three Musketeers or something very similar, where it was a kind of steampunk thing. The Duke of Buckingham had a blimp or something, and there was some stuff involving going around underground in these kind of gothic passages, catacombs, I suppose.
That one's definitely from this decade, and I'm going to have to stop saying this decade for things that are now quite old after this year. We're getting to the end of the decade, but I suppose it's still quite new. I was absolutely not for six that Orlando Bloom wasn't playing Aramis and the Duke of Buckingham. It was just the Duke of Buckingham. Someone who looked slightly like Orlando Bloom was playing Aramis, but again, as you were saying earlier, they didn't make anything of it. And it was a very boring, very unamusing, very stupid film with James Corden as Portia, which really was the crowning turd in the water pipe.
It was a Muppet movie where I originally was telling you about it and said there was a bit where I almost didn't mind it. And this steampunk Orlando Bloom Musketeers movie had a bit where I almost didn't mind it, and that was the bit where D'Artagnan, badly played by an annoying actor, was annoying all the Musketeers and getting chased and challenged to sword fights. And I thought, okay, maybe they're going to do it properly. And then they stopped doing it properly, and it was really bad. And the other thing I chiefly remember is that Orlando Bloom doesn't know how to say redress the balance. He's a readdress the balance. So he's almost as bad as Peter Capaldi.
And certainly a lot worse than Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, there's an end to another podcast. And if you join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in August, you'll be able to hear our next podcast, which will be on the Look Who's Talking film series. Until then,
Good night out there.
whatever you are.